Welcome and thank you for attending my presentation about Theresia. Theresia is a girl whose life I truly feel sorry for because it is the story of a girl who was blessed with skills for homicide. But in reality, she's the most peaceful girl in the world. In fact, it is no exaggeration to say that she is very similar in innocence to the protagonist of the series, Emilia. Now I will tell you the story of her entire past before the anime, as well as other interesting aspects of her character, such as her feelings, her strength, and the scarce future that awaits her in this third season. Theresia was born into the Astrea family. Her mother was Tishua Astrea, a focused woman who was generally the voice of reason in the marriage, and her father was Veltol Astrea, a loving father who, although he never became the sword saint due to his lack of skill with swordsmanship, still ended up becoming the most respected swordsman for Wilhelm and Reinhard. It is known that she had 3 siblings, 2 older brothers and 1 younger brother. At that time, her uncle Freibel van Astrea was the sword saint. So the Astrea family was constantly training the children so that they could earn the honor of becoming the next bearer of the divine protection. And although Theresia was a girl, that did not prevent her from being subjected to that training regimen. However, it was evident that she had no interest in the matter. It was not that she was bad at it, but rather that she was someone who was naturally a pacifist. But the reason for her pacifism is somewhat complex. You see, from the moment she was born, she was aware that she possessed the divine protection of the god of death. This power allowed her to inflict wounds on her enemies that could neither close nor be healed with restorative magic. That is why, even though she was already someone who did not enjoy harming others, knowing that she had such a capability only strengthened her conviction not to hurt anyone. So she decided to hide the full extent of her power from everyone. But that would not last long. One day, her uncle Freibel van Astrea arrived at her home, announcing that he had lost the powers of the Sword Saint's divine blessing because that blessing had chosen a new successor. This new successor was Theresia. This event had a great impact not only on Theresia, but also on all her siblings, who had dedicated their lives and bodies to the sword. It must be difficult to realize that, despite all their effort and dedication, the god of the sword simply did not respond positively to them. Instead, he chose a girl who had never shown any particular interest in dedicating her life to swordsmanship. In case you did not know, it is said that every bearer of the Sword Saint's divine protection can hear the voice of the god of the sword. We do not know who this god is, but we do know that he seems to be a real bastard. That is because when Theresia was the bearer, she could not help but notice the irony in how the god of the sword chose her instead of one of her brothers. You might think it was not intentional, but that possibility falls apart when we learn that the god of the sword spent over 20 years mocking Theresia while she bore the title. But returning to the present, when Theresia was visited by her uncle, he immediately made her fight against her eldest brother, who was said to be the most skilled. Neither her brother nor she wanted to fight, but as soon as her brother took a combat stance, she could not help but notice the number of openings he had while fighting. She also quickly assessed the weaknesses and strengths of her opponent's sword, and it is said that from that moment on, whenever she entered combat, she would see white lines over her opponent, lines that served to indicate the best angle of attack for each sword movement. Theresia did not want to move. She did not want to fight. She did not want to win, but her body responded instinctively, and with just one movement, she humiliated her older brother. This is how the kingdom learned of the existence of the new Sword Saint. And to make matters worse, the demi-human war had begun. During the days when the kingdom was eager to have Theresia make her debut as the Sword Saint, she met the person who would be with her until the last days of her life. This is a person who has not yet appeared in the main novel, but has played an important role in Lugunica's past, and I'm sure that eventually they will be integrated into the main story. I am talking about Carol. Carol was Theresia's best friend. She was the only one who stood by her at all times. And although their relationship was officially that of master and servant, in reality, Theresia never accepted that label and always treated her as a friend rather than as an employee. It was with her that Theresia went to her first war, and although the young sword saint remained uneasy, Carol tried to calm her down, but it was not enough. And while she was restless in her tent, waiting for her turn to be called into action, Thames, her eldest brother and firstborn son, spoke to her. He told her that although he had mixed feelings the day she defeated him, that did not change the fact that he still loved the sword and his entire family. He said that it was precisely because of his brothers and sister that he had the motivation to love the sword, and for that reason, he believed that no matter what happened, he would continue to dedicate his life to it. Theresia felt embarrassed because until then she had only considered that her brother was a fool who had no other option but to dedicate himself to fencing, when in reality, the fool was her for believing that he was being forced. Thames sensed her worry about the battle, so he told her that she could stay behind, as he knew that she would not hurt a fly, and thus, he went to war in her place. Thames would be the first of her brothers to die fulfilling the role that Theresia refused to take. Later, in another battle, her second older brother would also perish, and shortly after, her last younger brother would also die, replacing her in another war that the young sword saint did not want to attend. Theresia lamented her inability as more reasons piled up not to raise the sword. She recalled how understanding and empathetic her first older brother was. She remembered how bitter her second older brother was, but even so, that did not change the fact that he was the first to apologize to others. And she remembered how fearful her younger brother was, but still, that did not prevent him from going to the war that Theresia refused to attend. She felt hatred and resentment towards her uncle for placing this burden on her. But eventually, even her uncle Feeble Astrea would die on some expedition that she refused to attend. However, before that, he genuinely apologized to her for forcing her to take on this burden, and thus Theresia was left without an objective to blame. The kingdom was disenchanted with her and hid the record of her failed participations. It seemed they were embarrassed. But even so, Carol never distanced herself from her and fervently believed that eventually Theresia would rise and fulfill her role. So, during this time, it was she who went to the wars for Theresia. And in those days of uncertainty, Theresia had begun to leave the capital and go to a field where some flowers grew. This place really caught her attention, and that was because despite being in such a chaotic place, the flowers managed to bloom despite the adversities. Perhaps she thought that her life could be the same, or perhaps not. But while she was immersed in these thoughts, a boy named Wilhelm would arrive at the place. I will not go into much detail in this part because I already narrated the encounters that Wilhelm and Theresia had in their PPT, but I will narrate what she thought of the afternoons she spent with the young boy. Theresia felt a certain fascination and curiosity for Wilhelm, because for her, being an expert swordswoman, Wilhelm seemed like a kind of human sword, an immutable and interesting sword. While Wilhelm was far from perfect, that did not change the fact that there were certain traits about him that caught her attention, but she did not know why. She knew it had nothing to do with the fact that Wilhelm was persistent in fencing because her brothers were also persistent. But there was something more. Theresia would watch as Wilhelm slowly began to change. She saw how he went from being someone who did not know why he wielded the sword to becoming someone who chose to use the sword to protect. Deep down, she began to wish to be one of the people he longed to protect. Also during those days, Wilhelm would tell her that he had finally been promoted to knight, which, if you have followed Wilhelm's story, you must know how important this was in the boy's life. The day that tragedy struck, that is to say, when the demi-humans attacked Wilhelm's hometown, he asked her before saying goodbye to stay safe and left for his old home. When Theresia arrived at her house, Carol informed her of the situation and how the demon of the sword was in an endless fight against the demi-humans. The truth is that Theresia had many mixed feelings. The war had until then taken many precious things from her, and determined not to lose anything else. She finally finds the resolution to voluntarily go to the battlefield, all while hearing the laughter of the sword god again. Upon arrival, she saw how 3 demi-humans were about to finish off Wilhelm, and without thinking, she decided to surrender to the dance of war and saved the boy. While she took care of the front line, her friends took the incapacitated Wilhelm away from the place. It is said that that day the demon of the sword killed 300 demi-humans, but according to some reports, it was known that the saint of the sword in this first appearance killed more than 1,000 demi-humans. As soon as Wilhelm recovered, he went to the flower meadow, as if presuming that Theresia would be there, and he was not mistaken. It would be in this place where they both discussed and fought briefly. Theresia would show her superiority by incapacitating him effortlessly, and before saying goodbye, she adopts his way of thinking. You see, Wilhelm had gone from not knowing why he wielded the sword to deciding that he wielded the sword to protect what he had. Before leaving, Theresia said that she liked that reflection and that she would adopt that way of thinking. She left while in the background she heard Wilhelm telling her that he would make her put down the sword. At the same time, it is said that she could hear, once again, the laughter of the sword god who seemed to mock the young man's declaration. 2 years would pass in which Theresia would fully dedicate herself to her role as a weapon of the kingdom. She did it not for pleasure, but out of obligation, and because it was also a way to protect Wilhelm. And one day, out of nowhere, they informed her that the war had ended and they were going to hold a celebration in her honor. It was there where Wilhelm would return, and after a fierce confrontation, he managed to defeat her. Honestly, this fight is somewhat debatable, and that's because even though Wilhelm won, the truth is that he barely did. In other words, it was a fight that could have gone either way. Also, when we see Theresia's point of view on this, we realize that as the battle dragged on, her feelings for Wilhelm intensified to the point where it became difficult for her to focus on the fight. Even the author mentioned that Theresia might have actually won, but that doesn't change the fact that a single moment of doubt was enough for her to be defeated. After all this, their wedding and reunion followed. Things I already talked about in the other PowerPoint, so no joke. Go check it out. But something I could add here is that for a few months, Wilhelm was basically a freeloading bum. But going back to the point, Wilhelm was unemployed and spent his time training, so for a while, his future wife was the one who took care of him. It was even Theresia herself who had to get him out of jail after the scandal he caused by fighting her. She was also the one who convinced her father, Veltol Astrea, to stop meddling in their marriage and happiness. Later, the events of X3 would take place, but since she no longer wielded a sword, she trusted Wilhelm to handle things. However, the most interesting part would come in EX6 when she was kidnapped by Stride. Theresia could have defended herself, but at that moment, she was pregnant, and Carol was being held hostage, so she had no choice but to obey the Archbishop's orders. But when she was finally left alone, something interesting happened. You see, she had always felt remorse for all the lives she had taken. Deep down, she was just a girl who wanted to live an ordinary, peaceful life. At this point in the story, there was an enemy capable of invoking people's regrets. In Theresia's case, she was attacked by the ghosts of everyone she had killed. But just as she had negatively impacted the lives of others, there was also the other side, the people she had protected and loved. Because of this, it is said that at that moment, illusions of her siblings, uncle, and father appeared. By then, they had already died, but they protected her one last time. This also served as a symbolic farewell to her loved ones. And why do I say symbolic? Because the dead are dead. They were just illusions created by magic. Think of Theresia's reunion with her loved ones as the same thing as Subaru's reunion with his parents in Season 2. Afterward, she lived a normal life with Wilhelm. She was also thrilled when her best friend Carol got engaged to her partner Grim, who happened to be Wilhelm's best friend. Later, she gave birth to Heinkel, and once again, we don't have much information about what she did during those days. However, we do know that when she started living as a housewife, she discovered certain aspects of her divine protection of the god of death. Theresia had always thought that the wounds she inflicted wouldn't close until she distanced herself from her opponent. But in reality, she could close them if she wished. However, if she did nothing, the wounds would remain open forever. This ability would later play a crucial role in defining her fate. When Reinhard was born, it is said that she instinctively recognized his potential and felt sorry for him. Even though he was just a child longing for love, his parents couldn't respond to his feelings because of the tragedies they faced. Of course, she made sure to play with him and care for him when her son couldn't. But that phase didn't last long. The day she decided to take Heinkel's place and lead the troops against the White Whale, she was only able to do so because she had previously attacked Wilhelm and cut him so that he would stop following her. She warned him that if he did, the wound she inflicted would reopen. At first glance, this might seem selfish on her part, but just keep in mind that this is just a summary. There's more to her words. Things like the feelings of Reinhard and Heinkel. Before going to her death, she asked Wilhelm to tell her that he loved her. That's because Wilhelm had never said it to her, not even once. It's not that he didn't feel it, he just had a different way of expressing affection. In the end, she told him to say it when she returned from the subjugation. Although Wilhelm eventually told her that he loved her, unfortunately, he was never able to say it to her directly because of her death. He only said it when he finally killed the beast that took his wife's life, the White Whale. The exact process of how she was revived is unknown. Well, there are theories, but they contain heavy spoilers. However, what's strange is that even though she was killed by Pandora, for some reason, she ended up under Capella's control. Could it be that Capella and Pandora are close enough to lend each other tools? Who knows? But let's move on to the next section. The truth is that Theresia was a very strong swordswoman for her time. I know there is a stigma that she was only strong because of her protections, but the work never claims this. It simply tells us that she was not interested in such things, and since she was not interested, she did not make an effort to learn and improve. Personally, I think she had talent, although I am sure that her talent was not as great as Wilhelm's, and that is simply because her husband loved the sword far too much, unlike her. As for her strength, I would say that she was always stronger than Wilhelm, but love blinded her and made her lose. This is just my interpretation, so it is not canon, but it is really difficult to read the part where she fights against Wilhelm at the ceremony, because it seems that while Wilhelm is completely concentrated, she's actually thinking about him. So she lost merely out of carelessness, but if she had fought without distractions, I am sure she would have won. Lastly, her divine protections made for a very good combination. The fact that the Saint of the Sword has the divine protection of the God of Death, which allows her to inflict wounds that do not heal on her rival, is a terrifying idea. It is a pity that we have not seen much use of this in the secondary stories. I'd say she had the ability to surpass Prime Wilhelm, but her lack of will and motivation put her just slightly below him and also below Cecilus. However, I'm sure she was stronger than Friebel van Astria, the sword saint before her. She was probably one of the top 2 strongest characters in Lugunica at the peak of her life. In her first practice with her blessing, she effortlessly disarmed her older brother, who had years of experience over her. Then, in her first official battle, she was able to kill over 1,000 demi-human soldiers. Remember that Wilhelm barely managed to kill 300. So, at least in the beginning, it seems Theresia was 3 to 4 times stronger than her beloved. It's also known that she was the one who ended the demi-human war. Her feats were what led the enemy to agree to a ceasefire and request a peace treaty. After that, she didn't achieve many more accomplishments since she dedicated herself to her family, but she surely excelled as a housewife too. The truth is that Theresia's story has already ended. When she dies for the second time and regains her memories, that moment will be heartbreaking. That's because when Wilhelm is about to tell her "I love you" before she disappears, she tells him it's not necessary. That even though he never said it out loud, he always did through his actions. As she fades away, she uses the last of her strength to wipe the tears from her elderly husband's face. However, there was one regret she took to the grave. She never got to tell Wilhelm that, in reality, her love for him was love at first sight, and that she was grateful to him for giving her such a wonderful life. I like to think she must be waiting for him in the afterlife. But tell me, what do you think about Theresia's life?